Evening, everyone. There we go. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Unfiltered Conversations with the Unfiltered Historian. I'm Tyler, and this is
Tim?
Hi, Tim. It's good to be back on for one of these guys. If you guys just watched our stream earlier, thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't seen it yet, check it out on our page because we have that on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch for you guys to go back and see. It was a tough battle between John and myself, but I still didn't manage to break that line. Something's got to give eventually, and I'm going to do it. And he's offered to switch armies next round, and I've even offered him, like, well, let's go to Little Round Top and let's try it there. So maybe even an added challenge, but it got pretty stagnant at the end of the match, so that was fun. But just a few housekeeping things going on here with the Unfiltered. If you guys may have seen it, we have posted 3 events that are going to be taking place in February and March. Obviously, we do have plans to make these talks go throughout the year, so it's not just limited to February and March. It's kind of a trial and error thing. We haven't done any of the author talks yet, and I figured that would be something really cool for us to start. So we do have 3 authors in the month of, or 2 in February so far, and then 1 in March. So look for our events to talk about who's coming on, when, and what we're talking about. Other than that, it's a new year. We're in 2022. Most of the streams you've seen are me and John gaming because most of us have been snowed in. There hasn't been a lot of opportunities to go out and travel and do a lot of historical stuff. So we've had to improvise by A, with COVID-19 still being very present, and B, snow everywhere. Can't really go do a whole lot at the moment. So improvising a little bit. So thank you guys who stuck with us. There's my housekeeping. Tim, you mentioned earlier today that you were all over the map when it came to history. I know I'm throwing it right at you to start, man. But do you want to elaborate a little bit for us and tell us what's going on in the world of Tim and history right now?
Well, I'm more or less in a grad school pause, just personal stuff going on. So more or less taking a break from, not even taking a break from research, but just broadening my horizons for a couple weeks. I've always had pretty eclectic tastes. So in the last few days, I've done a little reading on Lewis and Clark because of, I don't even like to say family connections because then everyone's like, oh, really? And it's like distant kin, right?
Right.
A couple cousins, a third and a fourth cousin. Turns out they were interpreters for the expedition. Both of them were French Canadians, which gotta tell you that as soon as I found out like French Canadian connection, like my genealogy exploded.
Right.
That's purely because French Canadians by and large, well, when it was controlled by France, the only religion authorized was the Catholic Church, and their records were pretty meticulous. So as soon as I found that, I went from like my earliest connection in North America being like on my dad's side of the family coming over in like 1820 from the Hanover, Germany area to, oh my gosh, they were here 200 years before that in Quebec, some of the founding families of Quebec. And not surprisingly, with 200 years in Quebec, you're going to have at least one fur trader in the group. And I have several.
Okay.
And their kids would go off and oftentimes take up the trade, and based out of like Michilimackinac in Michigan and other places, some kin. First cousin was one of the founders of Green Bay. But that being said, go Vikings. And then one of the guys, he's relatively notorious. The fourth cousin was this guy named Toussaint Charbonneau.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, the captor husband is probably the best word to say it, of Sacagawea. Though it's kind of funny in their writings, Lewis did not like him, basically said he was worthless. He made a good blood sausage, Lewis said, though. So I guess there's that.
There is some usefulness, right?
Yeah, Clark liked him, though.
Yeah.
So, and it's pretty cool. We have a local Clark connection because he was born, 15 miles away from us
Mm-hmm.
down in Ladysmith, and there's a sign for that. This other guy I found pretty roundabout, and it tends to be the case. But I was reading one of the, these groups, Old West groups that I'm a member of on Facebook, and they mentioned another Indian woman who had a very similar story to Sacagawea.
Mm-hmm.
She was married to a Métis, which is a French Canadian mixed, with Indian, and the husband had, as a child, encountered the Lewis and Clark expedition because his father, a French Canadian, had been an interpreter. So, French Canadian last name. I look it up in a couple databases, and he was a fourth cousin.
Fourth
So
cousin.
relative is, yeah. But this other guy, what was his name? Trying to remember. I've been doing so much stuff. One sec.
You're good, man. Take your time. So I completely understand what it's like to be all over the map. Sometimes it takes a minute. You got to like really pick and choose what to remember from there.
Well, I'll figure it out eventually. His first name was Pierre, though, and he
Mm-hmm.
was a last name began with a D, but for life of me, I can't remember what it was. I looked him up in Family Search and, linked it to my, did a tree connection. And it turns out he's and it makes sense. There's a couple lines I'm 100% sure about, and his was one of them. It's very well
Okay.
documented line. The people that it relates to in my line is very well documented.
Mm.
Turns out he's a third cousin.
Oh,
So
cool.
I have a third and a fourth cousin who were involved with the expedition, and having been to the as a child, a cousin of mine lived up in outside Portland, and we went up when I was living in California. We went up and visited, and we went to Fatsup, which was the location on the Pacific Ocean where they finished the expedition. So I've been there, and I've been to Gateway Arch, so I've been to the beginning and end of it. So it was, that was pretty cool. What else was I into? I do have a healthy knowledge of Napoleon, and I get sucked that way too. So I
Yeah,
was
we were
reading
talking a
about,
bit about that.
I was reading about the Battle of Quatre Bras, or Four Arms is what it stands for, which actually took place before Waterloo, the 2 days before.
Okay.
And so I was reading up on that, and then I found an interesting book, that has all the war diaries from the war diary entries from July 1st, 1916 for every British battalion that was engaged at the Somme. So I was reading about the Somme.
It's a lot to read too.
I didn't, I finished nothing, but I
Of
kind of
course.
was dabbling in lots of different things. You know, I don't only just read history stuff. Like I'll find a documentary. Like I found the PBS Lewis and Clark
Mm.
documentary that Ken Burns did for like $4 on
Oh,
Amazon.
cool.
So I was watching that. I like to. I know he's a divisive figure in history, but I've always liked Ambrose. So I was flipping through Undaunted Courage, which was
I have that. It's
which
actually
is
right behind me.
yeah, which is
Yeah.
one of my favorite books of his.
Rightfully so.
And I mean, it's really very Lewis heavy, but still, um, yeah. And it brings up memories that I have, because when I was even younger, I guess
Mhm.
somewhere between first and third grade, one of the sites we would go to, we were living in Omaha, was a little bit up the river. This old army post called Fort Atkinson, which was an 1820s post. Well, right across from that was one of the places named Council Bluffs. It isn't the modern Council Bluffs, but it overlooked the river, and it was one of the first locations where they had any interactions with Native Americans. So, so I've done quite a bit with Lewis and Clark, and then finding out a family connection. It isn't like the funny thing is in Civil War genealogy, which we talk about periodically. At least I finally found a tie, but in a conflict involving millions of men, I found one grandfather, a couple uncles, one who was a 90-day volunteer, and they stuck him on an island doing guard duty, and he said to heck with that, had done his duty and didn't re-up. Another guy served throughout the war, but one grandfather. Yet I've got all these cousins that were involved in the Lewis and Clark expedition, and there's probably more. I guess the one thing I did leave out is I was also reading, what is it called? Donovan's book on Custer's, on the Little Bighorn. That is another passion of mine. Like so many in the Civil War field, I found that the two biggest prior interests coming to Civil Wars, like Jim Hessler's pretty open that Little Bighorn preceded his interest in the Civil War. And then several people we know, their first historical interest was the Titanic, yet then they come to the Civil War. One probably on the surface makes more sense than the other, but but even then, it's pretty interesting, and my interests have always ranged. I don't know, like Civil War is always the thing that I'll come back to, right? So
it's a roundabout for me. I'll never not come back to the Civil War.
Yeah, so I'll go always off, say I'm Civil War today, I'll be on it for like 2 weeks, and then I'll go do something else like Revolution for 3 days and come back to Civil War. Go do World War II, come back to Civil War. I don't go from one to something else. I always come back to Civil War, then pivot elsewhere. But I think the two longest standing overarching topics I've had are, Civil War and the Old West, various phases of it. I tend to like the military history of the West a little bit more. I can relate to it a little bit better. But having been to, I guess you could call it the top two Western towns in between Deadwood and Tombstone.
Oh, sorry, my phone was a little out there.
Yeah,
I was checking our Facebook, see if there be anything there. For some reason, the personal Facebook doesn't come up here.
Right.
Never understood it.
But having been to Tombstone, Deadwood, I like those places as much. But the West is all encompassing. It all depends how you want to think of it, right? One of my favorite debates to have with people is, my family hails, or both my parents were from Minnesota, but was Minnesota a Western state? And there's arguments to be made both ways. More often, people will probably say no. Strictly speaking, if you define the West as anything west of Mississippi, well, then yes, it is. Or a large portion of it is. Some of the other metrics, they were running cattle there. The town in where a good chunk of my mom's family comes from is just across the Red River from Grand Forks, North Dakota. And if you look at pictures from like the 1880s, it's not demonstrably different from like Dodge City, running cattle through there. Most people are dressed similarly. You have boardwalks and the appearance is there. My favorite one to trump people with is Jesse James, a figure of the Old West.
Okay. I like Jesse. I think we were talking earlier in 2021 or later. I don't know what you would call it. Now we're in a whole new year. But I was talking a little bit about Jesse James. That was someone I was getting into, especially considering you and I talk a lot about the Old West. Jesse James is one of the prominent figures that stuck with me, probably for obvious reasons. I mean, it's like the most probably easiest outlaw to love, even though we're not supposed to necessarily love outlaws. But those stories, of course, are just so captivating for us, man. We can't help but to flock to it.
Well, I guess that speaks to my point. I've never loved the guy. He was engaged in Civil War. He fought in Missouri, and most people don't think of the Missouri as the West. Yet they view Jesse as an Old West figure. Some of his raids went out into Kansas. Yeah, Kansas is West. Iowa, maybe, maybe not. But if you're going to find a documentary in the 90s on Jesse James, it's probably going to be in Tales of the West or whatever it was called on the History Channel. And it's always going to be, he's going to be featured in there in the Western outlaw. Well, where did his gang finally meet its end? Met his end in Northfield, Minnesota, trying to rob a bank, which he picked because its chief investor at the time was Adelbert Ames. So it had a Civil War nexus in the Minnesota.
He knew it was Yankee money, so he wanted to go after it.
Yep, and a group of Minnesotan townspeople shot his gang all to hell. So, but then again, that's one of my favorite things about that state is it's tied in. Most people don't think of Minnesota as really historic, but it does have a lot of cool things to it.
Produced the first Minnesota. I mean, come on now. They're one of the most badass Civil War regiments ever.
Yeah, true.
We'll say that. Like, we do have a Civil War connection.
And all Minnesotans do have well, I won't say all anymore, but a lot of Minnesotans still have deep affection for First. But in terms of historic events in the state, that isn't where people are looking for.
Mm-mm.
But people don't realize this. There's when you think national parks in Minnesota, they have Voyageurs National Park. It isn't a historic park, but then they also have Grand Portage National Monument. That was basically the western terminus where the voyageurs, the French Canadian canoemen, would basically paddle these big giant canoes with dozens of men in, I think it was 10 or 15, something like that, from Montreal across the lakes all the way into Lake Superior, and they'd finish at Grand Portage, pick up furs, return them to Montreal, and that's what most of them did. And I did have a couple of ancestors that did that trip. God bless them, because Lake Superior is no joke. But so they have that. But then the James Gang raid on Northfield was historic. But then you get into the 20th century, and one of John Dillinger's shootouts took place at a hotel in St. Paul.
Okay.
So there was Prohibition era gangster activity, and the Barker gang hit out in Minnesota for a while. There were sites of a few speakeasies and things like that you can go see there. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And then during the Civil War in '62, you had the U.S. Dakota War, which was one of the other sesquicentennial events I was able to attend. I went to Sumter and that was about it. But it's interesting state, and once again, like I said, all over the map.
It's all right, man. That's the best part about history too. And like, we talked about pigeonholing, which isn't a bad thing for a lot of, history related subjects, but you're definitely not. You have this very wide spectrum of things to study in the annals of history. And I love to see, it's almost like, hey, Tim, what are we studying today? Or what are we studying this week? It's cool because I'm getting all these areas of history as well that I can hear what you're learning about, and we talk about, a little bit about what you're reading or maybe what's fascinated you this day. And it's just really cool to see it hop around from so many different eras of history. And I think
Right.
it's tough to do at the same time. And I so commend you on that for sure. Like being able to hold up and remember all this stuff from these different eras of history. Because I'll tell you right now, like I'll read quite a few Civil War books, and you called my bluff the last time I did this, where I was all about Vietnam for like 2 weeks. I really wanted to study the Vietnam War, and that was kind of my niche at the time. And of course, I still revisit that all the time. It's not just on the back burner. I mean, it's still a focus, but there's so much Civil War stuff now. But you called it, you said, oh man, I gave you 2 weeks. You were nice enough to give me 2 weeks. I think I realistically lasted probably like what, 2 days, 3 days. And then I was like,
Maybe.
damn it. A map
Well,
caught my
I'll
eye.
be there too. Really, it's something that spark your interest. Um, Leading up to our Antietam trip, I was off on something else at that
Yeah.
time.
I
But
was on Fredericksburg for the 159th. Then we go to Antietam. I'm like, okay, I need this, I need this, I need that. Like, I'm still on the Antietam kick. I got there, Maryland sitting right next to me. I'm rereading again. Also, that's one of our author talks. Cool little shameless plug right there. Make sure you check that out on February 9th. But yeah,
I mean, and I got it. The funny, like some of these little fads don't last more than an evening. A week
sure.
ago, we were, you know, in the midst of all the COVID scares or stuff or whatever. We just needed to get out of the house, and we did drive down to the peninsula, really just to take a drive, just the family.
Hmm.
And we went to a park down on the peninsula that I went to as a kid, I guess, in between sixth and eighth grade. Well, I'm on the peninsula, so I can't help myself. It's
No,
like I can't not go to Yorktown. It's
of
just
course.
we didn't really do anything there.
Hmm.
But we parked the car, did a little circular walk down to the waterfront, and then back up the bluffs. Um, so I came back, and that night I read a little bit of Yorktown, but I wasn't really in a Revolution kick. But
Understood.
it wasn't like an in depth thing. I love doing Yorktown in depth. It's As I've said multiple times. I don't know if I've said it on a stream or not. Some people will ask me, which battlefield do I know the best? And that actually is not an easy question.
Hmm.
I know Manassas pretty well. I killed a lot of time there living in Northern Virginia. But it's Yorktown. Um, I mean, I can go off into the woods and find my way around. I know the fortifications from the Rev War inside and out. That's not to toot my own horn. I'm sure the Rangers down there could trump me any day, but that's probably the battlefield that I know the best. Um, that being said, there's not a whole lot to it. I mean, that isn't to say it's necessarily simplistic, but it's a siege.
Right.
So very simple. It's like the French were from here to here, the Americans were from here to here, and the Brits were back there, and there were readouts, 10-9, 10-9, Pigeon Hill, Fusiliers, and there you go. So yeah, when we get a chance, I'm looking forward to showing you around there.
Yeah, no, and I hope we can bring some content out with that too. That would be really cool. First of all, I'm just really excited to see this with you. I haven't been in person to see this stuff with you yet at Yorktown, and I've also just barely grazed the surface when it comes to even seeing stuff at Yorktown. I've got some
Well,
high hopes for it.
food for thought. It was the sharpshooters battle. So break out your Berdan stuff
I
and
will have to.
read about your ancestor, because that's where there was there was a little infantry fighting that's considered part of it, but that's not in Yorktown proper. It's actually in what's now Newport News, over in what's Newport News Park is the place. That was the Vermont Brigade attack at Dam Number 1, I think was its name.
Okay.
But on the battlefield itself, yeah, on the Yorktown battlefield preserved by National Park Service, it was really a sharpshooters battle. Only one battery actually ended up opening on the Confederate lines the day before they withdrew. You know, they were firing 100-pound Parrott rifles. These were really massive guns.
100-pound Parrott rifle does sound pretty large. Like,
yeah, but
jeez.
the location of that battery I've identified.
Oh, really?
That was a mortar battery, and when we get there, I mean, I know I did the video there, but the thing that really is hard to convey, you know, using camera equipment, is the size of the bluffs and just the sheer logistical effort that the Union engineers took to construct, not only construct the fortifications, but get the equipment up there, build the magazines, and then just to have the Confederates leave. It's hard to fathom the disappointment that they must have felt
Right.
at that. I mean, and it's also very interesting to think like what was Prince John Magruder's feelings like. He pulled a fast one on McClellan.
Oh, he really does. I mean,
In
from
a big
my
way.
general understanding.
So who's asks if we ever get into the French and Indian War? From my perspective, I do a little bit, especially after I found that French Canadian perspective. I mean, for those who, if I've never talked about it, when I was in college, I worked at Mount Vernon, and one could say that George Washington's like my first or second biggest hero. Well, I found that out, and I looked at, you know, different ancestors, and it turns out at the same time, French and Indian War, one of the majors in the Quebec or Montreal militias was a direct ancestor of mine. Well, we will never know because the militia records don't say this person went off on this expedition, but we know that the French Canadian militias were constantly sending militiamen out. We don't know who they were. But the funny thing is turns out, you know, one of my direct ancestors very likely could have taken pot shots at my hero. So it's pretty interesting.
You see where Hardy lives, right?
Yeah, between Fort Ligonier and Bushy Run Battlefield. That's cool.
That's awesome. Knew nothing about it. And I have a book that I've told Tim I have this infamous thing called the to be read pile, which I'm sure many of you guys have one yourselves. And that's been in the pile for a while. I do want to eventually get to the French and Indian War before I study the Revolution. So, which is what has put me off from studying the Revolutionary War, is I want to tackle French and Indian first, because if I'm going to look at Washington tactically, I sort of want to understand a lot of his beginnings. And, you know, Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like a good way to start is looking at his record in the French and Indian War and some of the things he's doing while he's fighting in that whole conflict. Not to mention, it's technically a world war. Would I be wrong in saying that?
Some will say that we should add at least one number to our current numbering of the world wars, making it either the second and third or third and fourth, with French and Indian War and potentially the Napoleonic Wars being considered world wars. I don't know that I go that far. I don't think it matters. I think right. We get wrapped around the axles there. One of the interesting things about Washington from a French and Indian War perspective is you know, he's constantly advocating this is how we should do things to his British superiors. And then in the Revolution, he proceeds to do almost none of it. He finally gets, you know, command of an army and is constantly trying to fight a linear battle. Despite seeing, He saw a French and Indian force that was usually outnumbered. I mean, reality is let's just look at the colonies. First of all, for both New France and the British colonies, that the French and Indian War was the first time either parent country had sent significant numbers of regular troops to North America. The French maintained these colonial military establishment called the Troupes de la Marine, which was, because it was their naval department administered New France. So those were the only regulars, but they're spread out in less than company-sized detachments to all these various forts throughout Louisiana and New France. Those were the two colonies in North America. And the British were no different. That's confusing. So the British, and one of those British equivalents actually reinforced Washington at Fort Necessity. So that was pretty interesting, but only after Fort Necessity, heading up to the Braddock expedition and the Monongahela, did the British start sending regiments over. But for
that's right. Braddock gets killed, right? And that's pretty much what prompts the British to start really sending people over.
Well, he was part of the first wave of regulars coming, because it was a year after Fort Necessity. It was really, the onset of hostilities that Washington really started. I mean, if you want to consider it a world war, George Washington starts a world war, firing into French, basically a diplomatic mission, the equivalent of what he himself had done a year earlier. And kills Ensign Jumonville in what's known as Jumonville Glen, northwest of Fort Necessity. And they massacre this detachment. One escapes, runs back to Fort Duquesne, which is now Pittsburgh, and they, retaliate, capture Fort Necessity on the 4th of July, 1754. So Washington really doesn't remember the date all that well.
Too fondly. I was about to say, yeah, well, not a fond day to remember.
Kind of a Vicksburg moment. But for most of the entire period known as the French and Indian Wars, from 1690 until 1763, it was really just colonial militias fighting each other. And the disparity in numbers was huge. I mean, the British didn't exactly overwhelm New France. Some would say if the French had sent another couple or a few extra regiments, that the British would have failed. It's a possibility. We'll never know. But for much of this period, it was the population of New France at the time of the French and Indian War, the final one, was 70,000. 70,000. Plus maybe 20,000-30,000 in most in Louisiana, but 70,000 against 1.5 million in the British colonies. So the numbers disparity was huge.
Yeah, I mean, significantly so.
So the French actually fought using those tactics. Now, circling it back to Washington, he saw how effective they could be, how, you could do it, but then he always sought, this, linear battle. Some would say after he enters his Fabian phase after Brandywine that he doesn't, but he really isn't fighting, so you have him try to fight pitched battles in Long Island and throughout the New York campaign. And then he is basically a linear battle again at Princeton, and then at the Brandywine and Germantown. And then his army really doesn't fight again for a year until Monmouth in 78, which is a linear battle. And then that's basically it. Monmouth is the last linear battle he fights. The very next engagement that the entire army takes place in is almost 3 years later at Yorktown, and that's a siege. And then it's 2 years of negotiations, and the war is over. but he doesn't fight a battle like the French ever fought, like the French fought
Right.
at Monongahela, which was an ambush. He was defeated at Fort Necessity by Canadians and Indians and French Marines, who were mostly their officers were. The French Marines were interesting because their officers were Canadian gentry, and the enlisted men, by and large, were French citizens. So, um, a few Marines, a bunch of Canadian militia, and a bunch of Native Americans surrounded Fort Necessity, took cover in the tree line. There's a really cool diorama at Mount Vernon in the visitor center about it, showing, because Washington failed to cut the tree line back beyond musket range. So the French are within musket range, hiding behind trees, taking pot shots at the garrison. At one point, he actually brings the men out in formation in front of his
Oh
trenches.
shit.
And they're getting picked off, and he orders them back into the trenches because the French aren't taking that bait. Why would they?
Mm-mm.
And in those battles, it was, mostly ambush style.
You're making me want to jump around the map, Tim.
Yeah, well, what can I say?
You got no arm twisting abilities here. You just got to start talking about this stuff. And I'm like, damn, I could just go pull that book from my shelf right now and really start reading about this, couldn't I?
Yeah, well, I could pull off. What was another one I was on? I was reading about Conde Gratz, which is Austro-Prussian War,
Whoa.
and Franco-Prussian War.
Not even gonna ask. Not entertain that one. Like, no, God.
Yeah,
Put
but
another one in.
because I see there's so many ties to these. Each one is because it's tied in some way to what I was looking at before it. With the exception of Lewis and Clark thing, I'm always a
Right.
sucker for.
That's like my Titanic too. It's that one that's just kind of out there. I'm like, look, I've got this too.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I understand.
Or like, yeah, I don't know that anything else has really had the ability. Like, John posted the Tombstone video a few weeks ago, and that got me in a Tombstone kick.
Of course.
Because I love the place.
Which is an awesome video. I'm glad thank you for posting that, John. Now, you mentioned Titanic, so now I'm going to go on my tangent. I have also found the need to get a side book fund going because there's this 2-volume called a Magnificent Ship, one of the two. It's $173 for the 2 books, which is like, whew. But it's got this nice sleeve protector. Each book's over 660 pages long, just of Titanic's designs. It's shipyard designs. So they have blueprints inside of it that fold out, and it's got everything you could think of. It's only 2 volumes just on the designs of the ships and the building of it and the construction and the insides, like specifications on the light fixtures, like specifications on the different wattage of electricity they were using for. It's going like as far into detail as you can. So it's on my radar as something that as a necessity for the Titanic study that I do. But on the sense that new stuff I've learned on Titanic is really regarding just the Edwardian age as a whole. And I'm just now, of course, once I can get to it, because I'm reading some stuff on Upton, which I'll get to in a minute, because I've got a passage I'd like to share with you guys today from his letters. But when it came to the Titanic, one thing I first studied, obviously, was just the human aspect of it, more so of the stories that the survivors told us. But one thing that, and I think Tim, you might remember this conversation that we had. I found a metallurgy study of the ship, and for some reason, that was a huge stopping point for me. And I went back, and now I'm looking at different aspects of the ship, and the construction really became something I became almost more fascinated with than the wreck itself. Is what went into building it, and the classes of different Irish citizens at the time that were building the ship. There was a lot of strife and violence in Belfast. Belfast is known for that. You know what I mean? I mean, Belfast is a very tense city, especially in the Edwardian era. I mean, it's tense today. But we rewind back to the Edwardian era. Belfast is kind of a hotbed for a lot of extremist groups in Ireland. And so these classes are coming together to build this ship in Harlan and Wolff shipyards. And they're building this ship for the British. And we can even
Mhm.
go into further and be like, it's funded by JP Morgan. So White Star Line is in a transfer period at this time, which is really interesting to kind of look at too, before it's going to get merged with Mercantile Marine. There's so many different things that happen with White Star. But at this time, when Titanic's being built, JP Morgan, US financier, we all know who JP Morgan is. He's in a way the impromptu owner of the White Star Line. This is in a transfer period going from British hands to almost a joint American British run company. So you'll see a lot of paintings, especially after the disaster of the Titanic, with an American flag and a British flag flying on the ship. And the thing about that is that it didn't happen on the ship. There wasn't, to my knowledge, an American flag flying on the Titanic. Yes, there was a lot of wealthy passengers. I mean, for God's sake, Milton Hershey was supposed to be on that list if he didn't get sick, supposedly, or to cancel his ticket. J.P. Morgan himself was supposed to be on that ship. Again, he doesn't obviously get on that ship. What a different tune we could be humming if he did. But one of the interesting things about Titanic are the figures that are on it too. You would think with these high-ranking American first-class individuals, the Guggenheims are on the ship, or Benjamin Guggenheim's on the ship. We have co-owners of Macy's, the Strauss, Isidore Strauss and Ida Strauss.
Mhm.
They're on the ship. These are very wealthy and notable people at the time. So, of course, our American psyche thinks, yeah, there's somewhere on this ship is an American flag again with the transfer company, but there's not. But it is interesting to see that in a lot of the paintings that subsequently come from the sinking. There's just so much that go on markets, and souvenirs are immediately sought after of the Titanic. So paintings again become in demand. So there's this rampant painting of British flag, American flag. But again, I had no idea even as a kid, and probably by that age I didn't know who J.P. Morgan was. So I'm just not really putting much thought to that. But what a different story you get out of Titanic when you realize what went into it and the people that are helping to make this ship actually happen, and the joint country effort from so many different walks of life and so much going into this. And there's a history within each part of that, I think. And there's just a wealth of information that can be studied. And Titanic's not just a ship that goes and sinks. There's a passenger story, of course, with so many passengers on that ship that did survive and left us accounts or letters or what we may have from mail, because Titanic was a Royal Mail steamer too. So we have a lot of examples of that early period of bringing mail back and forth and having a mailroom on a ship and things of that nature, having a purser on a ship. I mean, there's just so much to learn, and I can't even put my finger on where to start with that. But on the other side of the map, I'm calling the other side of the map Civil War. I'm really into this Upton study, and of course, I'm speaking on Upton. So I did make my. I don't even have New Year's resolutions, but I did say January 1st. I really need to make sure that I am honing in on my Upton studies, and I have been, and which is awesome because it's a very eye-opening experience. So I've been going through letters recently, and I'm still at West Point when it comes to Upton. I'm really reading them slow and a lot of the notes that go along with it, and then going through other sources that have stories. I came across one thing that really stuck with me, and I'm in agreement with all of the other authors that have talked about this, and as well as Salvatore Cielo, which wrote the or compiled the two letters and wrote Upton's Regulars and countless other resources on Upton. Um, One thing that they are talking about in kind of a together thing is this huge fight that happens at West Point between Wade Hampton Gibbs and Upton over slavery, to the point where some
Okay.
say it was a sword fight. And there are instances where Upton is slashed in the face and Wade Hampton Gibbs is slashed in the face with the sword. They're fighting in a above a dining hall. It's supposed to be the second division hall. I think it's a very interesting story, and I want to find more about it, but there's nothing concrete about it. within, but there's countless of accounts of this happening. But Upton, if he wrote about it, we either do not have it surfaced yet, or his family destroyed it, or he simply just didn't write about it. And I'm in the crowd that if anyone even makes this argument, I would agree more so with that he didn't write it, judging by some of the letters that I've already read and gone over so far. The letters that I've read and gone over so far have pointed to a man who writes intensely about his love of the Christian religion. He's a very Christian guy. Like, he's extremely held on to the belief of religion, especially at West Point. One of his brothers died, younger brothers dies from consumption or tuberculosis, we believe. Early
Hmm.
on in his West Point career, I believe it's in 1859 or 1858, somewhere in that realm. And he has to go home and deal with that affair. So that's on his mind too. But he still writes in this feverish belief in God and that doing right would put you in heaven. And you don't really get a lot of the political stuff with Upton at that point. Again, those letters may not have surfaced, so it also ties into the fight as well. Is he going to write about a fight he had over slavery when I'm not seeing a lot in his belief at that point in abolition? And I know he's a fervent abolition supporter, which is awesome to know because he's coming from a certain part of New York known as the Burnover District, which is heavily progressive Christian, if you will, in modern day terms, where yes, there's this huge abolition movement going on. Of course, we have notable figures in the surrounding area like John Brown. Okay, John Brown does a little thing in Harper's Ferry that's pretty relevant to that, and it's almost he's almost deitized in the Burnover district in the 19th century, late 19th century, going into the Civil War, because there's a lot of fanaticism that comes out of that area, and there's a lot of Renaissance too, if you will, in the literature aspect of that area. A lot of the Upton stuff I read that his primary source has an allusion to Henry David Thoreau. I'm not that far into it to confirm whether Thoreau had a lot of dealings with the Burnover district. There's actually now research that goes into that has to be done. But I mean, I'm seeing where Upton's getting his formulative ideology going into West Point, on top of being a fervent student at Oberlin College. If you're familiar with Oberlin in Ohio,
Hmm.
I think it's Ohio. Yeah, he's got a upbringing there as well, so he's not necessarily going into West Point without opinions. And that's some strong opinions at the time to be going into West Point with, especially in that class where you happen to be with folks like Wade Hampton Gibbs, Kearney. No, is it Phil Kearney that's with him? I believe at that point. Would have
What year?
1861 would have been the graduating year.
No, Phil Carney didn't even go to the point.
Okay, see, I got that wrong. It was someone. There was a notable cavalry figure that went to the point with him that
Well,
wrote
Custer.
about the fight. Well, yeah, the Custer would be in the class too, wouldn't he?
Yeah. I don't know which class of 61 he was in, because Custer was supposed to be class of 62.
He was supposed to be class of 62.
Yeah, they graduated him early.
Mm.
Here's an interesting fact. Did you know that? So, most people, well, it's no small secret to most of my friends that one of my favorite actors of all time is James Stewart. He hated Jimmy, so I'll go by his preferred name. Uh, his grandfather was a guy named Samuel McCartney Jackson, who commanded the 11th Pennsylvania Reserves. Was at Antietam, and then got cited for gallantry at Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Bethesda Church.
Wow, that's
And
pretty significant.
that was one of Stewart's biggest motivating factors for wanting to serve so much during World War II. He had that in his mind, his grandfather's service in the war. So pretty interesting stuff. Just not trying to get you off Upton, but that was a little
No,
thing
you're
I
good.
discovered. I've
No, you're
also
good. I
been
appreciate
I've been in kind of in a Civil War music kick. So
it. Well, a fun fact: Duffy was in a string band. I found that out by reading through Royal Fig's account of Parker's Battery.
mm,
Yeah, he was the part of the string band. I'm like, why is he not writing about this? This is incredible. And of course, still, I need to get the diary from the Virginia Historical Society. I still got to get down there and spend a day with that thing because there's 116 pages in that I have to go through. It's a lot of freaking stuff that I haven't read from him. I've had bits and pieces of some of the diaries sent to me, so I know a little bit about what's in there, but I haven't been able to actually go through. And then the other thing is, majority of it isn't transcribed yet. It's in the handwriting, so that's why I'm saying I would need a whole day with that thing because I'm gonna have to take picture page by page by page to take it home and transcribe it, and that's gonna take majority of my day. I'm not even gonna get to actually sit there and like hold the thing and admire it and read it. It's gonna be more than a day's effort to transcribe a diary like that.
Right.
You know what I mean? Especially with 116 pages, because I know myself too. And as much as I want to say that I have the photos compiled into one folder, and I know the page numbers were good. The problem is once I get a page transcribed and I hear all the action on the page or where he's at, my mind's going to go to maps. I'm going to want to look at other things, and each page is just going to send me on this like journey and loophole. So I really do look forward to that project, but I know it's also one that does kind of going into it stresses me out because I'm like, damn, I have to really time management is something I got to make sure I master going into this one, especially the time, whatever time I get with that diary.
Mhm.
'Cause even if it's only you can only have 2 hours with it, I'm gonna have to spend more time photographing the thing than I am actually holding things.
Yeah, I figure before I go to down to, well, if I even can get into the parks archives, um, if I um, if I, you know, am at Vicksburg or Shiloh and I'm able to get into their archives, it's going to have to be really fast. I'm going to have to know what I want to see and set it up. And I'm not going to be able to read anything while I'm there. It's just going to be photograph, click on the photo or scan and,
Yeah,
and do that because I just don't have that kind of time and I can read it when I get back. But I'm looking forward to that trip. So
yeah. No, let me know when you do that because I'll just go over to the VHS while you're doing your stuff at the park, and it's a big thing that I really want to do. But I know the VHS is doing renovations right now, so it's even with COVID and everything. I'm just like, damn, it's just another put off to getting this diary. It's the one thing I need left, and it's the biggest piece because it's going to put a whole new aspect of the war for him, at least that I've known for going on 15 years now, and I've been that's the last thing I need to get. And once I can get that, that's going to help a lot.
yeah,
So yeah, I'm going to shoot back to Upton for a minute just to finish off with what I know. I'm sorry I blab about him a
yep,
lot,
it's cool.
but one of the
Fast.
things that he really, when it was talking about him being such a Christian, and I don't want to say enthusiast, but that, I mean, he was very, very, very into it, and it drove him at West Point. I found out things like he got a broken collarbone. He doesn't write about complaining about normal things, except for I think the one thing he complained the most about was getting a demerit, and he explained him in such detail about getting a demerit and how bad this demerit was to him that he just was floored by it. The marks mean that he's done wrong, but alas, I can be this man that doesn't get any more, and that would wipe this one clean. And that says more about my character than anything. And he writes that. And I'm like, wow, that's a huge thing that, like, look, I detest this thing that I have and the thing that I did to earn a demerit, but instead of letting it destroy me, I'm going to do better from here and have that as my legacy rather than a demerit. And I thought that was a really cool thing. And that says a lot about who Upton is. I look at that from the writing. Of course, I've flipped through pages. I know what happens later. I've read a lot of his stuff before, but going chronologically, it's a little different when you're reading it like that because you're watching him steadily grow and mature in a different way from each year that he's writing, or even sometimes it goes by month depending on where we're at in the Upton story. But at West Point, it is like year by year, you're watching this different voice. From what I always joke is Upton's soap mine industry with his brother, and the
Mhm.
first letter that you read to this very beautifully written letter as an older brother to his younger sister about, you're the now the last young one in the household still under mom and dad. Our parents have raised us great. They had great, beliefs and teachings that have distilled wonderful children. You're the legacy of that since you're the last. So instead of, being the big older, he is giving her this rundown of your responsibility, but doing so in such a brotherly way. And again, it's cool because it not only does it humanize Upton, but it really shows his character. It's not this mean, tough, military, straight up guy that's just rule by rule. He gets a demerit for throwing a snowball in the lunchroom at West Point. Upton's not a stale dude. But everybody's like, he never laughed. I'm like, this guy threw a snowball in the mess hall. Are you kidding me? Like, you telling me he wasn't joking? Of course he did. But you get that stigma comes along with Civil War history. So many generals of this. Oh, Joseph Hooker was a drunk. So a lot of people, and trust me, working at the park those times, I've heard it. Joe Hooker was just drunk. Like, that's all you get. There's this huge stigma that floats around with it. And I think Upton had that with him when it came to being the strict military disciplinarian. And that actually should only be applied because of post-war. Upton was still very exploratory and experimental in the Civil War. He really formulates this revision of military theory in the United States after the war. Once he travels the world and sees all these different militaries and how they operate, Upton goes as far as Afghanistan to see these different militaries at the time when he does his Europe and worldwide tour, if you will. So to see that and then the reflection of what he writes post-Civil War is really cool too. But he's slammed very seriously. And Tim, you might like this. I'm glad we're live and I can talk about it. You could thank Upton sort of for creating a federalized National Guard.
Do tell.
Yeah, I found that out today. That was cool. I forgot to mention that. He was a huge proponent of, God, state militias suck. And then people took that to believe, especially some of the early military greats, believe that Upton was like, well, Upton's saying to hell with the volunteer army. That volunteer army put him up where he is today. Upton's not saying that. He's not saying to hell with the volunteer army. He's respecting it. He is saying, to clear that air, to hell with their commanders, those political hacks from Washington that have enough money to command somebody in a volunteer army, i.e. Dan Sickles. Love him or hate him. Upton's talking about you, Sickles. We're on that one now, on the third. Yeah, that's Sickles. But Upton is detesting this because, and dude, this guy's got no reason not to detest it. He was sitting at West Point. He graduates West Point in 61. He's watching the country tear apart at West Point and watching classmates that he has just spent 5 years with. Remember, West Point, year and 5 years at that time. West Point classmates he's known for 5 years go south. He's in that infamous class of 61.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a different.
I wonder if does Upton reference Patty O'Rourke?
I'll get back to you on that. That'd be interesting to find out.
Because I do wonder, I mean, there were a lot of people in that class or in that vicinity who made names for themselves, like Ronald McKenzie.
Yes, sir. And I talked a lot about him with Spotsylvania.
I'd be very interested to hear about the interpersonal relationships between those two, if there even
I'm looking forward to that. I know I would love to. Yeah, that's something I definitely have to try to dive into because of course, Spotsylvania, Randall McKenzie, in my mind, is the brainchild behind the attack that happens at Spotsylvania between him and Russell, just like Russell's at Rappahannock Station. Randall McKenzie's right there up front before Upton is, seeing what needs to be done.
I mean, Randall McKenzie is, a lot of people don't know about him. Arguably, he was probably, so I am interested in the Plains Indian Wars, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go off on a tangent about whether they were justified, not justified. That was the government policy, overwhelmingly supported by the populace of the time. Those are the facts. Was it harsh policy? Yeah, but whatever. We're not going off on that tangent. point being, I've followed Ronald McKenzie quite a bit. Robert Utley's book Frontier Regulars talks about his campaigns down in Texas quite in some detail. He and he was like arguably probably the best regimental level Indian fighter in the Army. Yet he gets to start in the Civil War. He pretty much stays as an engineer officer the entire time. You know, unless you dig into it, they usually say a staff officer of General Barnes or whatever. It was Ronald McKenzie who runs into Vincent. He's the guy delivering that order, and then he plays the hand in Spotsylvania, and throughout the Overland campaign. You know, he doesn't have the same interesting type career that, you know, Upton has, from battery commander to regimental to brigade, division, then cavalry division commander.
Right, he's just this, like, yeah, it's an enigma.
Or the Custer who, you know, gets his lift from captain to brigadier general and ends up commanding a division in the war. Speaking of which, got to take you to Cedar Creek eventually.
Yes. Does have to happen.
You know, so it's very interesting because is Upton at Cedar Creek or is he gone by then?
3rd Winchester.
So he leaves after 3rd Winchester?
He's wounded really severely at 3rd Winchester.
Okay, and then he gets sent to Kilpatrick, right?
He goes with James H. Wilson down south.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's cool because and I'm very shocked that I had this change of heart. And one of my friends, Cameron, if he ever sees this, he would laugh his ass off to hear this. James H. Wilson used to be one of my hated figures of the Overland campaign, the wilderness stuff, his foul up there. And I was very shallow in just judging that one maneuver. Because the minute I opened Peter Mischie's Life and Letters of Emory Upton, there's a foreword in there that is like 30 pages long, written by none other than James H. Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize how high of a regard Upton had for him, and likewise for Mr. Wilson there. And my whole entire perspective on Wilson shouldn't always change just because Upton likes him, so I must like him too. But I was like, okay, had he said this about Sheridan, I'd even revisit Sheridan.
Up through the Overland campaign, I mean, Grant liked him. He was a Grant protege. I think he was one of the ones who ended up getting into a tiff with Grant.
Probably
later, but which, to be honest, I mean, that's just not smart. You don't get in a tiff with Grant.
Gustavos' great chat about West Point. I would like to add that General Lee was superintendent when Stuart was a cadet, and he considered a son for him and also didn't forget what happened between Jubal Early and Armistead.
That's right. That last part's just hilarious.
It is.
I mean,
oh my gosh,
I expect if I'd gone to school with Jubal Early, I would have broke a plate over his head too.
That was the best part of the West Point tour, and we went up there on the bus. I didn't know that. I also didn't know that one thing. Edgar Allan Poe was a West Point cadet for a little bit. Yeah,
and then he ends up enlisting in the Army after, and he actually gets stationed at Fort Monroe. So when you make it down there, you see the mock classroom of Upton. There will be a little display about Edgar Allan Poe at
cool.
Fort Monroe.
I saw Benedict Arnold's name scratched out too. That was really cool.
Yep.
Yeah, West Point was an awesome. I think the thing that got me was over there by the we call it Trophy Point.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little park pull off you can do when you're up there, and when you're coming in from Thayer Gate, the first thing you really see up there is Trophy Point. And it's that look out onto the Hudson. When I first showed up, there was a huge barge coming down too, so it made for a really cool picture. Just moment to see the Hudson. I wish there wasn't the barge, but at the same time, it was kind of cool to see that. And that's before I even knew there was a chain that I have such a diverted focus on that history behind that chain. I would love to find some more in-depth reading on that too. I've been kind of searching ever since I left West Point to find something to read more about the defense of that during the Revolutionary War. Because I thought the engineering feat of actually building that chain to stop a British ship from coming down the Hudson was pretty damn cool. And
Right.
that was like, and as someone who went up there really for, okay, I need to go up there because there's most of my Civil War guys are that I study specifically Upton come from there. Also, my main thing up there was actually to pay homage to Alonzo Cushing. Believe it or not, that was my big thing
Okay.
because I like Cushing a lot. I still do, of course. I mean, I have a tremendous respect for the gentleman, but I had to go up there and see him. And I think I saw another Hancock, not Hancock, Winfield Scott. Believe it or not, that was my big
Oh,
thing. I
that's
like
my
Cushing.
phone.
It's okay. One of us has to do it.
Um,
But yeah, Winfield Scott, right? From our big Winfield Scott. He's up at West Point.
he's buried up there, even
Yeah.
though he never went to school up there. You know, he predates it. He's actually a William and Mary grad. So
Didn't know that. Okay.
yeah, he's training under the same person that Jefferson did, I think.
And he's from Dinwiddie, Virginia, too.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's it's an interesting place. Coming to to an interest in West Point in your 20s is probably healthier than when I did.
Yeah.
I came to that conclusion, going to Gettysburg, seeing on every soldier's monument or every monument to every Union and Confederate officer by and large, USMA, class of whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So to silly me, that meant, oh, you got to go West Point. So I gave it the old college try, so to speak. Didn't work out, but that was so long ago. Yeah, it's like I'm over it. So I do really want to
It's
go.
a trip I might make this summer for a weekend because the hotels up there are really cheap and it's West Point.
Yeah.
You know
Well,
what I mean?
I want to go for the revolution aspects. I want to go there to see the monuments they have, just to
Well,
see
if
the
we can
planes.
catch a weekend in the summer, man, there's no saying we couldn't just shoot up on a Friday evening.
Yeah, to Gustavo's point, that
What do you say there?
that Hancock imposing respect, even wearing civilian clothing. Yeah, I mean, by most reckonings, Hancock just had that demeanor. He did have a tendency later in life to balloon out, to gain weight easily, but at that stage, he was still trim and healthy looking, and he just had an aura. He walks into a room, he commands the room.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if he didn't look at Howard at Cemetery Hill, and that was all it took for Howard to back down.
So you can have it, General. It's all you.
Here's the problem with that. And I will go on a tangent about
Sure.
for a second.
About
That's what everyone calls him. I mean, the dude was heroic. He fought incredibly well on the peninsula. Sacrificed, lost an arm. He's in charge of the Philadelphia Brigade that gets victimized in the West Woods. That's through no fault of his own. That was Sumner's silly orders. You're going to go in old divisions like this. And stuff like that. Or Sedgwick. No, Sedgwick didn't do it. So he, that's not his fault. But then he gets to the West, right? With Hooker. And one of the two has to be true. Either he was a bad commander and was just facing opponents in the West who were worse than him, or he was a good commander with just unfortunate positioning from his higher headquarters. Maybe an element of both. I tend to think that his performance in the Atlanta campaign and onwards was exceptional. So I tend to be, at Chancellorsville, they hung him with a corps that the rest of the army disrespected, ostracized. I mean, during the winter encampment here at Fredericksburg, You have the Ninth Corps right across the river. You have the Sixth Corps right across the river. The Second's pretty much on the river. The Fifth's on the river. Where's the 11th? Way back at Stafford.
Reserve.
In reserves, out there, middle of nowhere. Yes, they got victimized by Jackson in the Valley, and then they get left in the Washington defenses after Manassas. And they launched some pretty valiant attacks at Second Manassas on the railroad cut. I don't think they were bad troops, but then Hooker leaves them out, flank wide in the air, and yes, Howard could have done more about that. But Gettysburg, I mean, you look, they're coming up. I mean, you were just playing it. How could John have spread out his men in order to cover everywhere that the Confederates came from?
Yeah,
you have to spread out the line.
He did a good job defending too.
And it just so happens that Gordon hits Ames's right and drives it in pretty easy. And then the Union command messed up for the troops that were below Cemetery Hill and then ran. If you've been at that stone wall at the base of East Cemetery Hill, it's just like the sunken road at Antietam, right? You're looking up. You have no visibility across the fields. The artillerymen above you do, but you don't. So you hear all this racket. You know there's heavy firing. You know something's coming towards you. Next thing you know, they're on your faces. But unlike the sunken road, where the trench provides some measure of protection, the stone wall is less than knee high. The Confederates stand on that hill. They fire right down into you.
Yep.
And plunging fire is, yes, they're going to overshoot, but they could also hit a lot of head wounds, which is going to have a morale impact.
Sure.
But then the units go west, and the 11th and 12th Corps merge into the 20th Corps, which by all measures is pretty much the best corps, perhaps in the entire Union Army, Eastern Western Theater, yet half of its former 11th Corps men. Now, I am a big 12th Corps partisan, so really looking forward to that author talk.
That is going to be fun. I know Chris Bryan's talking. That's going to be cool.
A detachment of the 12th Corps. I'm going to switch over to them real quick. A detachment of the 12th Corps, including the 10th Maine, which I'm passionate about.
Yeah, rightfully so.
Causes Jackson, for the only time in the war, to draw his sword or attempt to, and almost defeats him. And that isn't even the whole corps. They, are pretty much in reserve at Manassas. Then they go in and they fight really well. And Greene's division of the 12th Corps at the time makes among the furthest penetrations, captures the objective, at Dunkirk Church. At Chancellorsville, they hold and don't fall back an inch for most of the battle. They hold against Anderson's attacks, right? Or McLaw's. Anderson, I think, yeah. And then Gettysburg, you have Culp's Hill and all that. So 12th Corps, very underrated. So maybe all it took was the stabilizing influence of the 12th Corps, or the 11th Corps was never as bad as its record led people to believe to begin with. So yeah, and Howard, like I said, goes out west and does a really good job.
Yeah. I want to cycle back to what you said about the head wounds and morale, because immediately one of the things I thought about, and this is from a conversation you and I had a few months prior, you might remember this one. We were talking about the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery at Cold Harbor, actually, and the breaking point for the 2nd Connecticut. And Thomas Klingman is in North Carolinian on the opposing side. Quick picture for that. The 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery is a bandbox regiment, or cracker box regiment, if you will. And it's what was a nickname that kind of fell upon these guys because they were sitting in the defenses of Washington, to the words of the soldiers, doing nothing really. They were doing something. They were protecting the forts, obviously, but they're not infantrymen. They're not up front, and they haven't really served yet in this combat. Specifically, what's been breaking out since the beginning of the Wilderness all the way up to this point in Cold Harbor, it's constant combat. the armies are used to spreading out a little bit and having that reprieve from battle and then locking into it again in a mass scale months later after some recuperation. They don't even have that. They don't even have days. They are just continuously fighting and fighting and fighting to this point. Well, the Second Connecticut Heavy enters into the fray, and they're going to charge these works that are occupied by these North Carolinians that are obviously Confederates. And if you know anything about Cold Harbor, you can sum it up. The Confederates have a very entrenched position on June 1. And Upton is going to play a part in this engagement as well. And some debate whether or not he does some of the fantasy like attributes that stick to him.
What getting behind a tree, rallying the men behind the tree, and then say,
they
"Yes,
provoked
Nathan."
Someone say Cold Harbor. Yes, we did. But yeah, that exactly. But Clingman witnesses this commander of the Second Connecticut, Elisha Strong Kellogg, shot 3 times in the head. And I'm not trying to get gory and nasty with you all for a minute, but Tim hit something really hard. Can you understand that regiment breaking when they watch their commander's head get hit by 3 wounds? That's not a pretty picture either. Remember the calibers
ball that big?
Yeah. The guy's head,
Big the hole?
There wasn't.
It wouldn't have been there. I thought, or was that Potter? I thought Kellogg got hit no, it was Potter from the 8th New York. When he gets hit on the 3rd, he's hitting the leg, then he's hitting the shoulder, then he's hitting the side, and it's just Civil War combat does it. That's very, very. It of course doesn't show it doesn't show a dude getting hit.
No,
and that's part of people's issues. I mean, people talk about why they don't like some Civil War movies, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's unrealistic in terms of the graphic nature." I'm like, it's like, do you want a whole movie like that one image from Glory with that lieutenant above Shaw, with his head going?
Yeah, that's.
Do you want a whole movie of that? Because that's what it was. I mean, you're talking 58 caliber.
White Hill on 7 June.
Cool. I don't follow.
Pretty much saying Potter's top tier he then fought the Confederates at White Hill on 7 June.
Okay.
That was Cold Harbor. Okay. He's talking about the Potter. You were talking about getting wounded.
Okay.
Yep. But
the guy I'm thinking of was attached to, he was actually a cousin of John C. Breckinridge. So, and the heavies, I mean, by and large, got tore up. The Second Connecticut monument is very interesting because, they're. Where was
Colonel Upton on it too, by the way, if you ever see that.
Yep.
You seen that?
Yeah, I saw it. And then it's the 8th New York, which is attacking the 2nd Corps sector on the 3rd. That's 8th New York heavies attacking on the other side of the road. So you have the Park Road, then you have that farm right across it. And the 8th New York
Upton isn't heavily involved in the 3rd.
Well, the entire 6th Corps doesn't really move on the 3rd. They move slightly and then they
he's
stop.
with the 6th Corps, so.
I mean, but that terrain, you've been there. It's ate up, and Wright doesn't move. It's the 18th attacks, and then the 2nd Corps attacks. Burnside can't get his stuff together in time, so Nathan could talk about that. And the 3rd wasn't the Army of the Potomac's best day, but people forget. And I guess I'll give a plug to Nathan here, and I know he believes this. The battle did not end on June 3rd. So
there's a link in the chat. Come in. I want to hear this. Because now I'm interested.
So
Yeah, like I haven't gotten even up anywhere near Upton past Manassas yet. I mean, shit, I'm still at West Point when we're studying
Well,
him.
what are you going to do when your boy comes out with a positive view of Philip Henry? Just
Study.
hypothetically speaking, you know.
Not a fan. But we'll see. We'll give him a fair shake. Nate,
Hey,
what's going on,
Me
dude?
and me and this guy are both fans of
did
Sheridan.
someone say Cold Harbor?
Someone said Phil Sheridan well right before you came in too.
Me and this guy are both fans of
Oh,
Sheridan.
whoops,
Someone
sorry.
sent from Echo.
There we go.
All right. Yes, we are talking Cold Harbor, and I was.
He's even got a Sheridan stash going on right now.
There was a Union General Cold Harbor whose name I can't remember that he redeemed himself at Gettysburg.
Wouldn't it be the other way around?
Other way around. Yeah.
Okay, so what was the question?
Union General at Gettysburg that redeemed himself at Cold Harbor, I think is what the question was trying to say.
Actually, shockingly, I'm not a Gettysburg expert, but
Me neither, don't worry.
Really, I don't think anyone performed abysmally at Cold. I mean, I think that the thing is, then everyone remembers June 3rd. I think that's pretty common.
Mhm.
But what I was specifically talking about was Potter, who he was in Ninth Corps. He was a brigadier general. Can't remember if it was 2nd Division. But he was responsible for taking White Hill, retaking White Hill on June 7th, because there was a firefight that took place in order to secure that position, because Grant contracted his line past the Mitidating Creek in order to secure that line. And in fact, Jubal Early wrote in his memoirs later that he was frustrated by the fact that Grant actually positioned himself behind the creek because it prevented his men from actually breaking through at any given position. But there was one hill that was constantly fought over. And ultimately, the Union will hold it at the end of the day on June 7th. And it was also at this hill where the Confederates broke the ceasefire that they agreed to that day. And there are two sources that corroborate each other in that claim. So,
which is the one that Grant talks about, where he's talking about how there was a bunch of Confederate wounded, and he wanted a ceasefire, or was that what he was talking about, that the Confederates broke the ceasefire?
Yeah, so the agreement was there was going to be a white flag, a flag of truce across the line in order to collect the wounded. The interesting thing, though, to me is the fact that at this point in time, the Confederates are going to have more wounded men on the field than the Union. Most of the Union soldiers by this point are already dead because it's been so many days.
Mm-hmm.
However, what is left out of that equation is the fact that at this point in time, Robert E. Lee has already launched 2 different offensives against the Union line, because this is actually a big opportunity for Lee. Because at this point, Grant wasn't making any more assaults. He was focusing on getting his guys across the James. And so he had to hold a defensive position for that. So this was Lee's chance to retake that initiative. However, both of those offensives failed, and there were actually Confederate wounded across near Fletcher's Redoubt. And again, unfortunately, I feel for Pickett because once again his guys were blasted to oblivion near Fletcher's Redoubt. They didn't even make it out, barely out of the woods before just being shot to pieces. And then, of course, over on the Union right, there actually would have been quite a bit of Confederate wounded. However, again, what's pretty interesting here is that, Lee equally could have been like, yep, let's do a ceasefire, not a flag of truce, because I have guys I need to save. But he didn't. I think Ray does a good job. He just says they're two hard-headed guys that failed to take advantage of this opportunity. But I think the point that isn't discussed is the fact that the Confederates broke that ceasefire. And I can't figure out if Jubal Early just didn't get that memo or if he just didn't care.
Mhm.
It's possible that he was looking for an opening. I don't know. So, I think that's important when kind of at least discussing that. But I'm sorry if I threw that off a bit. I get excited about Cold Harbor.
Well, then the other thing he does that I consider is part of Cold Harbor is when Grant sends Sheridan with a good chunk of his cavalry out on the Trevelyan Station raid. I think he was waiting for Lee to make a mistake, and there Lee made a mistake.
Huge mistake.
Because Grant, by the time, the sources are pretty clear that by the time Grant gives Sheridan the approval to do that, and this to me shows Grant's
cavalry.
Grant's
Calvary.
Military. If you don't want to call it genius or call it common sense, call it whatever you want.
What's up, Messer? By the way, thank you for joining.
Call it whatever you want, but he knows that he needs Lee to make a mistake. He knows he can't bank on Lee making a mistake, and then he's thinking as early as I think the 5th about this James, maybe earlier about the raid or the movement across the James.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that by sending Sheridan, some Confederate, some of the Confederate cavalry is gonna follow him, and turns out it's the entire thing. It's the biggest mistake Lee, in my opinion, makes during the Overland campaign, because he is completely blind. Blind is July 1st to Gettysburg type blind.
Yeah, and I typically make the argument, if you're going to criticize Grant for sending Sheridan off before Spotsylvania, then this is a bigger mistake than that. This is when Grant sends Sheridan off, it's actually the turning point of the battle. At least that's how I interpret it. Because Lee, I still don't know why Lee did that, because Grant is on the defensive. And he completely falls for this movement of, now I will say this, if Lee hadn't sent out his cavalry, at least some cavalry, then they would have been doomed, because at that point they would have gotten
Sheridan could have rode right into Richmond from the west.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But
Calvary is a fun word. Oh, you guys just like seeing me triggered tonight. That's what it is.
Is it like
how many cats are being hit by Ed Bars right now?
Like driving nails through your wrists, Tyler?
A little bit. Or just like nails on a chalkboard. Oh, God.
The nails through wrist was a specific reference.
I know.
No, I was.
Whoa, I really know now. God darn it, Tim. It took me a second.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
It looks like.
Sorry, Nate.
No, you're fine. No, but to answer your question, Epic Messer, we're actually talking about Cold Harbor from. I characterize it as being from May 28th to June 12th. To me, the last action of Cold Harbor is not June 3rd. That big assault, that failed assault that takes place. And in fact, there's actually some success that takes place on June 3rd. There's the small breakthrough on the left. I think a lot of people know about that. It's brief, The Confederates will push out Second Corps. They'll push out Hancock's guys. So the left definitely falls apart, and I think there's definitely, to some level, I'm not a big fan of assigning blame to anybody, but I do think Baldy Smith. No, Baldy Smith did well. It was Horatio Wright's Sixth Corps. I actually somewhat criticize a bit. They didn't coordinate well with either 18th Corps or Second Corps. But on the Union right, surprisingly, there was actually quite a bit of success. They actually had to withdraw from his position because, again, here's throwback to James Wilson here. James Wilson actually flanks the Confederates, and he wins the Second Battle of
Hey,
Hobbs.
go James Wilson.
And
See,
so
that makes me
now,
like it even more. That's awesome.
yeah. And there was, and you see, I'm curious what this would have looked like, but Burnside, Wilson, and Warren were all planning for this big flank attack actually on the Confederate left before Grant actually suspended all attacks on the Confederate line. So I'm actually kind of curious what it would have looked like if he continued pressing at least the Confederate left, because clearly the Confederate left was actually somewhat collapsing a bit. Unfortunately, it never took place because Wilson was actually planning on attacking them from behind, because that's how far he was able to get around them. So,
Nate, it's rare that you and I have an area of disagreement. So here I come to Horatio's defense.
oh no, here we go.
So they move. Do they not? They move.
They do. They
move, but you have been there. So having been there, you're on the left of the Sixth Corps. You've got the ravine dropping down to the creek, cut up terrain. It's god awful. It's clearer than it is today, and you're not going to take that. And on the right of the Sixth Corps, you're across that borderline meadow thing that's at the northern end of the preserved portion of the park.
Sure. Yeah.
And after their experience on June 1st, which is all Sixth Corps,
yeah, it is, and
they're shot up. They've been in constant contact, really the only constant contact since June 1st. I think they did not. I can never completely exonerate a commander for failure to follow orders. They were ordered to attack. They did not. At best, I would argue that they didn't hurt anybody. They may not have hurt anyone else because they were clearly a demonstration at worst. So yes, I'll slam Wright. He didn't follow his orders. Succinctly.
Well, okay, I'm gonna take issue with Wright's response to high command, which is he said that I can't attack because the other two guys aren't coordinating with me, and it's like they've already attacked. They've already done their parts, and it's like you didn't like, and again, that's maybe, and I think there is criticism here, right? Some of that does fall back on Meade because it was Meade's responsibility to coordinate.
And by that point, Grant's back to being more of an Army group commander, and he's not micromanaging like he is at Wilderness, early Spotsylvania.
Yeah. That's true. And in fact, beginning on as soon as North Anna ends, he basically hands over all command to Meade for the most part. All tactical decisions for the most part are Meade. The only exception to that is actually Cold Harbor Crossroads. Even though Humphreys says Meade ordered him there, and so does Sheridan. Sheridan actually points out in his memoirs, there was actually Grant that was already looking at that area even before Meade ordered him there.
Grant also, he orders an attack on June 3rd. But he says you will attack. He doesn't say where you'll attack. He doesn't dictate it like he says you're going to strike the northern tip of the Muleshoe salient or whatever he called it at Spotsylvania like he does there. He doesn't specify. He just says you're going to attack. We need to retain the initiative, right? He's looking at a map, and I know this ties into one of your things with Grant. Like, he sees that if he takes New Cold Harbor, basically, he's got a straight shot to Richmond. And on top of that, with so many Confederates up on the Matadepquan, the Confederate army is then divided and can be chewed up piecemeal if he can break through there. And the irony is that is where Wright fails, because the only corps capable of achieving that exact thing really was the 6th Corps. Problem was the Confederate, none of this happens in a vacuum, right? You've seen those earthworks. Those are impressive.
Well, they're so different. They're extremely different than anywhere else in the Overland Campaign. The only thing closest to it is at Spotsylvania, and that's really it. The thing that I have with 6 Corps is, and this is a big what if, right? But I still tend to believe that if Sedgwick lived, there's part of me that I think they would have been better off with Sedgwick or really anyone else. I'm not a Wright guy. I know he's kind of like, cheese and crackers, I guess, if like just kind of plain.
Quietly competent.
Right. But he's not.
Is he like a Doubleday-esque figure? Someone who's never brilliant, never terrible?
Right. Yes. And that's kind of how I see that go. In terms of Grant being in command at the tactical level, he really doesn't do that until the interesting thing is he does take over some tactical decisions after June 3rd. Mm-hmm. So I don't blame Grant actually for telling me like you're going to coordinate this assault, because between May 26th and June 1st, he does phenomenal. I mean, they're winning like all these little tactical engagements, especially with the cavalry and in many different areas, whether that's Hawes Shop or Old Church or Old Cold Harbor Crossroads, whatever it may be. I mean, look, a lot of that's Meade.
And he probably should have, Grant probably, when he directed the movement across the James, he probably should have taken tactical control over Baldy Smith and Hancock and coordinated that himself, because he had an intent, yet he left it with Meade. And, he wins the war. I mean, Grant wins the war. He could have won it faster on that day on the assault, the June 18th assault.
Yeah, and he even admits that in his memoirs. He says that in his memoirs. He's like, I could have won. He even says I could have won on June 16th, but I didn't. So, and by the way, if he had, then the interesting argument there is, like, he would have actually upped his timetable, because he said he wanted, he thinks the earliest he would have won the war is actually in November of 1864. Now, of course, that coincides with Lincoln's victory, which I find interesting. And maybe he kind of understood if Lincoln won, he kind of would have had full control at that point. But I think he also understood that there were chances to win even before that, whether that's at Petersburg. I tend to think the crater is really I've always typically argued the crater was his biggest failure, because if he would have won the crater, no one would have cared about Petersburg, at least on June 15th. The argument then would have been, oh, he could have won a month and a half earlier. Like, I don't really know who argues that. But really, yeah, absolutely. I think he should have focused more on that. I think there's also an argument to be made that the James River crossing was also a very risky maneuver. So Grant also needed to be there. Who do you leave that maneuver in charge with?
Well, when the crater itself, the Battle of the Craters, July,
right?
Isn't it? And when does Lee cut the second corps loose on Early's raid? Is that July?
No, he does that right after. I mean, he's already thinking about doing this even before the Battle of Lynchburg, but it really isn't until the Battle of Lynchburg he wins it on June 18th, which is actually the same day, I argue, the Overland campaign ends with the order for siege operations. So, Early then starts heading out to Washington after his victory. Grant doesn't pick up on it until much, much later. And that's because he moved the Bureau of Military Intelligence across the river. They had to pick up their stuff and leave. And that was a huge intelligence failure on his part. And in fact, after that, he actually had to reorganize the whole Bureau in order to make sure that never happened again. Because he was telling Macon.
Real quick, Nate, though, where does he move him to?
I'm actually not sure. I need to look that up.
Because the line, Grant, so I'm going to absolve Grant a little bit for like the crater, because the crater is coinciding roughly at the same time Grant's having to deal with, he's getting the reports about Early around Washington. So he's dealing with that. Not to mention Grant's siege lines, operations against the Petersburg-Richmond line, they stretch from Petersburg to Richmond. He's got the Fort Harrison thing going on, roughly same time frame. He can't. Yes, Petersburg gets the lion's share of the attention, but he's got two corps still up opposing the Howlett line and stuff and all that stuff. Fort Harrison, the Bermuda 100 line with the remnants of, Butler's Army of the James.
Okay.
So he's now basically putting the BMI is no longer a entity of the Army of the Potomac. It is an entity of Grant's Army group, because Grant wears 2 to 3 hats at the same time. He is it variously at times in the campaign functioning as an Army commander, an Army group commander, and then a commander-in-chief, a theater commander. So all simultaneously. He's the only general really in American history who ever did that. May 5th or May 6th, you could argue he is wearing 3 hats.
So Tim, you're actually you're telling me this, and it's only reminding me of how frustrating it is trying to sift through who's ordering what.
Yeah.
In my throughout the Battle of Cold Harbor, and as I'm trying to sift through this research on Cold Harbor, it's extremely frustrating to figure out if it's Meade or if it's Grant, and it really is not helpful that that there's all these that to some extent I almost wish he just played one role. I wish there wasn't this strange Byzantine structure of command, because and I'm just being selfish at this point. Makes research a lot more difficult.
Who are we gonna blame for that? I know who I'm blaming for that. I'm blaming Tyler. I'm looking right at your face, waiting for a smile. I'm blaming Henry Wager Halleck.
Yes.
For that. And here's why.
That guy.
Grant. So Halleck functions as Grant's de facto Army group commander in 62. And he's awful at it. He's awful when he takes command. He's awful when he isn't commanding. So Grant's like, I'm not going to be like that guy. Then Grant becomes an army. Then Grant becomes an Army/Army group commander, moving into Vicksburg and Chattanooga, the latter stages of Vicksburg and onto Chattanooga campaign. And Halleck's still above him. and he's the commander-in-chief, right? Not commander-in-chief, commanding general of the army, so the theater commander, if you will, or the whatever you want to call the Halleck's attempt at being commanding general. And the war commander, he's commanding the war, and
he is,
and he's garbage at that. So Grant's like, I'm not going to be like him there either. Halleck is the example to Grant for what not to do. And so being held back by this guy for 2 years, prevented to do everything that he wants to do. And then he gets in and he's dealing with Meade. I can understand some of the Grant's tendency to micromanage there because he sees it and he's like, yep, this is like what I've seen this before. I think we should do this. And then Meade comes by and he pouts saying, and Grant's like, yeah, I get it. I'm going to back off. And then they do it again. And he's like, when to insert himself. He had the right to insert himself wherever the heck he wanted. He had the right as commanding general of the army to go down, pick a regiment and say, you're going to launch a frontal attack right now. He could do that. It's how the military works.
Wait, so you're telling me that Henry Halleck didn't perform well during Second Manassas?
Would you be so shocked?
I'm going to tell you about the only thing that Henry Halleck ever performed well at was acknowledging that he overstepped his bounds and trying to seize all credit for Fort Henry and Donelson and eventually restoring Grant to command.
Bingo.
And
Henry Halleck, he did a great
he authorized
job
the Island Number 10 operation. He did that well.
He did a great job being in Washington at a desk and then sending off letters to everybody.
You know what? He was a great chief of staff for Grant.
Just keep it coming. Bash Halleck, guys.
Bash. He was.
You're like.
He was.
The unfiltered doggo.
Oh yeah, sorry. I have my dog. This is my pug. This is Ruby.
Ruby, you're the unfiltered doggo now. You've
that's
worked
right.
your way up the ranks quicker than anybody in this organization.
Will is in bed. Sorry, Tyler.
That's okay. Will though. But
so, like Halleck, in my opinion,
back to the Halleck bashing, please.
I can bash two Civil War figures all day long, every day. I can bash Halleck and I can bash Bragg all day long.
I don't know. I feel like Pillow. I feel like Pillow could fall into that
Floyd
that category. Yeah, easily. Good. Yeah. But yeah, there's quite a few I could put in that category.
Pretty much anybody but Butler involved with the Fort Donelson, Butler and Forrest. I'm not complimenting the KKK Forrest. I'm just saying at Donelson, he tries to save his command and refuses to be surrendered.
Poor Buckner. Poor
Buckner is left with the little, his commanders abandoned him. I mean, in any other war, I kind of feel like Pillow and Floyd should have been shot.
Oh, I would have loved to hear Buckner's opinions of them after that. I bet he had. I bet he just always cussed under his breath after that.
I mean, to be honest, the reality was, that was the first time Grant was ever. You could call him brilliant. You could call it common sense, moving between the Tennessee and the Cumberland. Mm-hmm. But the second he starts his movement, the Confederates have the time it takes Grant to march from Henry to Donelson is the Confederates' window to do the one option they had, which was burn their stores and fall back to Nashville. When Grant gets to Donelson, he's gonna win Donelson. It's gonna happen. I mean, the Confederates may escape, but he's gonna capture the location. The Confederates will lose control of the river. In failing to break out, people always say, well, Grant The frustrating thing there is everyone tries to slam him at every turn. They basically accuse him of a McClellan-esque during Glendale, Malvern Hill. He's off on a naval ship. He didn't know there's going to be a battle, and as soon as he finds one out, unlike McClellan, he rides to the sound of the guns. He assesses the situation. He recovers and drives the Confederates back in their fortification. That's not McClellan-esque at all. In fact, to a person who views Grant objectively but comes out admiring, it's an insult because there's no similarities between Grant and McClellan. And my favorite what if after that, after Donelson or Shiloh, they pull not John Pope, but Grant to the east. What happens if Grant gets special orders 191? What if it's Grant with 90,000 troops on the banks of the Antietam on September 17th?
You're throwing me for some crazy ones. Oh shit!
Is it okay here if those are all really good questions. Although I kind of want to. I'm sorry. I want to shift gears here just for a second because.
Can I cut you off? I hate to do. Can we?
No,
chat
I was going to
offline?
ask you a question. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Because I think we had this discussion, Tyler, about McClellan, right?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm interested.
Okay. So, what did you get a chance to read McClellan's War by chance?
Not yet. I had to shift gears. I'm on a heavy Upton kick right now.
Okay.
Obviously, I got some studying I got to do, but yeah, I'm on a heavy Upton kick, so it's a little tough there. But no, I haven't.
We need a McClellan talk later, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was
I'm done with my rant.
No, you guys love them all. For podcast sake, I got to cut it here. But I want to offline chat with you guys once this is over to catch up with Nate. I haven't talked to you in a while. And then Tim, your knowledge and expertise is needed for what I'm going to bombard Nate with. But yeah, offline, unfiltered, off air, cool stuff. Maybe one day we'll get a Patreon so you guys can listen to our offline chats. That would be cool.
Oh man. I don't know if that's a good idea.
I think it's a great idea. It would be an awesome thing, but we'll work on that because
if only Darren was here.
Well, Darren has to be there for that.
Oh yeah, Darren, don't worry. Oh my god, that'll definitely be subscribers 17 plus or whatever the FAA requires you to mature. The airwaves will not be on. Don't worry, it's all recorded. You can just listen to it later.
Mm-hmm.
But guys, this has been a tremendously awesome podcast. I think it's our first podcast of the year, which is awesome. So this will be the first one that goes up and is on Spotify. So this is our first podcast of the year. Tomorrow night we are having another Unfiltered Conversations. Darren and myself will be on. Not sure as of a time yet, but once I talk to him, once the pond awakens on the other side there, it's that place over there awakens.
We should put up
we'll get the time.
A clock of England at the bottom just to show what time it is in England.
Okay.
At all times.
Okay. We could do that. That would be cool. Hardy, well, we enjoyed having you, man. We always do. I also enjoyed playing War of Rights with you the other day, even though we just kind of got clobbered over there on the sunken lane. We tried valiantly. We did. Well, we won that one, actually. What am I talking about? We won that one. It wasn't until we get to Burnside Bridge where everything goes to crap and you crash 2 times in the middle of the game. No biggie,
I didn't
right?
see that.
Yeah, I crashed twice. I didn't stream that one. I was offline with that one. We had a good time, though, and I look forward to doing some more of that. But you guys are awesome for tuning in, and you guys are awesome for hanging out with me. I'm so glad we get to rant about a whole bunch of shit. That's the best part. So, Gustavo, thank you so much for being here too, buddy. I'm glad you like it, man. We have more of this coming because 2022 is a year we can really hunker down and focus on Unfiltered a little more. And you guys are helping us grow day by day, so we really appreciate everything you guys do, and you're tuning in, and your support has been incredible. We play the weird ambient music that we have on this page. It's just, I don't know. It's cool. We'll see you guys again next stream.